In 1980, I was young, single, had a full head of hair, and very adventurous. I was living in Juneau, Alaska at the time, and I really needed an escape from that claustrophobic capital city. When an Australian friend told me you should visit New Zealand, I knew almost nothing about the country then, but I went anyhow, and I fell in love with it from almost the minute I stepped off the plane. I spent 3 months down under that first trip, long enough to skip an Alaskan winter, and I've been returning ever since, looking for more of that adventure I found that first time I arrived. To most people, New Zealand is Middle Earth, the setting for the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and the home of director Peter Jackson. To anglers, particularly fly fishermen, New Zealand is legendary for its trout fishing, browns, and rainbows. Still, to others, New Zealand's the birthplace of the bungee jump. But to me, New Zealand has always been this destination for great escapes into a wondrous wilderness. Truly a place where it's easy to leave the road and go tramping for days on end. That's because New Zealand has a incredibly strong outdoor culture and heritage. When they need to escape on the weekend, they fill a rucksack with provisions and some rain gear, and they go tramping, what we refer to as backpacking. On tracks, their word for trails. Tramping is as much of their an important part of their heritage as a good 7 day cricket match, a beer at the local pub, and of course, cheering on their beloved All Blacks rugby team, especially when they're playing South Africa. New Zealand is a long, narrow country located across the Tasman Sea from Australia, but it's further south than most of Australia, so it lacks that tropical appeal and the the warm seas and coral reefs of its neighbors. What it has that Australia lacks are mountains. There are mountains from one end of the country to the other, and just not the Southern Alps. Mountains with high alpine passes, snowy slopes that in the winter, our summer, offer some of the best downhill skiing in the Southern Hemisphere. Because New Zealand is long, narrow, and very mountainous, there are places in this incredible country where you can spend the afternoon morning exploring a glacier, then drive a few hours and spend the afternoon walking a track that's lined by palm trees and overlooks the Tasman Sea. The other reason for the great tramping in New Zealand is because New Zealand is a country two-thirds the size of California, yet has a population of only 5 million. The vast majority live in the northern half of the North Island. California has 40 million. This is why New Zealand can preserve so much of its land as national parks and state forest parks, more than a third. No other country, including the US, has such a high percentage of protected land. What New Zealand doesn't have are bears. And, there's going to be a lot of backpackers from Michigan probably pretty happy to see that. Actually, New Zealand didn't have any mammals at all until the British showed up and introduced things like possums and stouts and red deer and even elk. That doesn't mean when you're tramping in New Zealand, you don't encounter a few large mammals, but they're fairly domesticated. And if you just keep your distance, they won't charge you. The other thing that New Zealand doesn't have are snakes. And even in most unusual, it doesn't have anything that's poisonous. Unlike Australia, where it seems half the animals and insects possess enough venom in that country to quickly end a tramp. But there is one thing I must warn you of, something that when you encounter it, you immediately stop, you back up slowly, and then you run. Yeah, New Zealanders love to tell Americans that Vegemite is just like your peanut butter. It's not. It's a bacterial extract that is black with an incredibly strong flavor and odor to it. It took me 20 years before I could sit down in the morning with a New Zealander and spread it on my toast. And that's only because there was no peanut butter around. Like the mountains, New Zealand has tracks from one end of the country to the other. With a single ferry ride, you can literally trek from Cape Regina, the most northern point on the North Island, to Invercargill at the south end of the South Island. Tracks range in all types and sizes and lengths. Many are developed with planking and bridges that are well posted and easy to follow. Many in this mountainous country are a crest along an alpine ridge. You, it's ridge walking. You carefully tiptoe along until a sign tells you it's time to descend. And many are true wilderness experiences where you're slogging through mud deep over your boots in a forest along what you think is the track, but you're not really positive. What makes tramping so distinct and such an unusual experience from backpacking in Michigan is the country's hut system. Spread across New Zealand along every major track and a lot of obscure ones as well are almost 1,000 backcountry huts. They're generally spaced out every 4 or 5 hours, and some are very capable of accommodating up to 2 dozen trekkers. Others are so small, well, they only have 4 bunks maybe and a tiny little wood burning stove in case it snows that night. There's no more enjoyable moment tramping in New Zealand than when you hike 5 or 6 hours and then you see the hut where you're bunking up for the night. You sit outside after you arrive and you take all those boots off, boots that may have endured a few bridgeless stream crossings. You strip off all those wet socks and you coax one of your mates to go inside and make a billy of tea. Yeah, that's all you really need at that moment. Inside the huts, they usually feature a large common room with a couple picnic tables, some benches, uh, a cooking area, and always some source of heat, whether it be a wood burning stove, coal, or even propane in the above the alpine. In this particular hut back here, there was 2 bunk rooms with each one slept 12 in regular bunk beds. Some of the older huts, however, use the shelf bunk system. They build shelf right across the room, and then they throw 6 or 7 mattresses side by side on a shelf. The thing is, in New Zealand, especially New Zealanders, they always stay in the huts. Camping with a tent, that you can do it, but it's really most people stay in a hut. It's a communal setting too, where you share counter space and tables, and if it's been raining all day, possibly a shelf bunk designed for 4, but there's 6 or 7 you in it, and you're happy to be share it with other people. Some people, particularly Americans, are uncomfortable in such settings. I've always found it to be one of the best aspects of tramping. Often the same handful of people will be hiking the same track as you at the same pace. And every night you'll all be at the same hut, sharing your experiences and examining what the next day will bring. On the last day, when you finish the track, well, everybody are good friends, swapping addresses and emails and heading down to the first pub they can find from the trailhead. The other aspect I've always enjoyed about New Zealand is its thermal activity. New Zealand is part of the Pacific Ring of Fire that includes Japan, Alaska, even California. One of the most popular tourist areas in the North Island is Rotorua, a town that features boiling mud and geysers and public bathhouses. But I've done a half dozen tracks where we have arrived at a hut and from its logbook learned that just down by the river, there's a hot spring bubbling out of the banks. You can always find it. Trampers before you have arranged the rocks into a nice little pool with flat boulders to sit on. It's a jacuzzi in the middle of the wilderness. What else do you need? The one drawback of New Zealand is that it is on the other side of the world from Michigan. Um, I generally fly to LAX because I'm blessed with a brother who lives in Huntington Beach. So I can spend a day before boarding an Air New Zealand flight to Auckland. It's not as bad as flying to Sydney, but it's still a 10-hour nonstop flight. And I almost always fly into Auckland because it's easy. Once you're there, you can jump to a domestic flight after you arrive and head straight to the South Island. And that's the beauty of New Zealand. It's relatively small. It doesn't take you 2 or 3 days to go from one national park to the other. Often it's just a couple hours. You don't even need to rent a car. In fact, if your primary thing to do down there is a tramp, a car can be a bit of a hassle, especially when you're leaving it at the trailhead for 2 or 3 days, and or you're doing trails that begin here and over there, and there's a mountain range in between. There will be transportation, either public or of a private company, running trampers out to whatever track they want to hike, or in many cases, a water taxi. But the real beauty of backpacking in New Zealand isn't its size or the mountains or even the hut system. It's the New Zealanders themselves, people who refer themselves as Kiwis. They're friendly, they're helpful, they love Americans, and they speak English, which I always appreciated. This is my daughter with a New Zealander we hiked with for 5 days on the Queen Charlotte track. As beautiful as that track was, getting to know Fred was the high point of that walk. Because of the growing popularity of tramping, back in the 1990s, the most famous tracks in New Zealand were set up as great walks. And that included building reservation systems for them and upgrading and enlarging the huts because they were getting overrun from primarily overseas visitors. The Department of Conservation, affectionately known as DOC in New Zealand, controls all the parks, tracks, oversees and administers every national park in the country. Their website is the first place you should go if you're contemplating a tramping holiday in New Zealand. The second place you ought to go, yeah, it's my guidebook. I like to tell people it's the world's best-selling guidebook to tramping and backpacking New Zealand, but I'll be honest, it's the only one you ever see outside of the country. Once you get down to New Zealand, however, there's a lot of guidebooks, trail guidebooks available. Two of the great walks are not even walks at all, really. The Wanganui Journey is located in the North Island, and it's a 3-day canoe paddle along the Wanganui River. It's the only river in New Zealand where you can have an extended multi-day paddle like this. The rest of the rivers in New Zealand are pretty much, they come out of the mountains too fast and there's too much white water for a canoe paddle. The Paparoa track is the newest great walk in the country. Yeah, I think it was set up only in 2019. It's near the West Coast and it's the first shared great walk. It's used by both trampers and mountain bikers. Bike packing is hugely popular in New Zealand. So this trail is almost more of a mountain biking adventure for most people than it is a walk. The rest of the great walks are walks, and two are located in North Island. Lake Waikaramona is a 46-kilometer 4-day tramp around one of New Zealand's largest lakes. It's located in Mururia National Park in the east half of the North Island. There's very little alpine. Actually, there's no alpine in this walk, so it's a one that a lot of people do first. It's a beautiful walk. A lot of times you're along the lake shore or you're hiking through this incredibly lush, semi-like rainforest. The other great walk in the Northern Island is the Tongariro Northern Circuit. It's located in the middle of the North Island in Tongariro National Park. Now, Tongariro National Park was the first national park set up in New Zealand, and it was established only 3 years after Yellowstone National Park was set up in the U.S. It's actually a 4-day, 41-kilometer walk that we conveniently start at the visitor center from the national park and do this 41-kilometer circuit, staying at different huts 3 different nights and returning to the visitor center. However, what has happened, the park was created because of the amazing thermal activity, volcanoes and craters and geysers and emerald lakes and so forth. The majority of that is right here. And what has happened is this portion has become the most popular day hike in New Zealand. People who stay at Turangi or Taupo nearby, there'll be van service that will drop them off here. They'll spend the day hiking back to Kadatia, where there'll be vans that'll take them back to their hotels. It's a long hike. It's a full 7, 8 hours, I believe, or even maybe even 9. But it's got amazing scenery with all the thermal activity and the volcanoes you hike past. The country's most popular hike is the Abel Tasman Coast Track. That's because it's located in the North Island in the area they call the Golden Bay. And that's famous for having the best weather in a country that's generally can be very rainy and windy at times. This is incredible, especially the Abel Tasman. Goes along a set of beaches and it really can have the best weather. It pulls approximately 30,000, I believe, a year. It's open, they hike it all year long. It's it's the track is I think it's 5 days, 51 kilometers. It's point to point, and it's well built. You see people doing tennis shoes, and you basically going around these bays and these beaches. There's a series of public huts. There's also some special accommodations. There's a hotel halfway through it. And it's not even necessary to do the whole thing. A lot of people will come in from Nelson and they'll get dropped off by a water taxi at one beach, and then they'll just hike a day or 2 days, and then they get picked up and taken back to where they came from. So it can be just a 1 or 2 day hike. The swimming is unbelievable, the water's warm, and generally the weather during the summer is pretty good. The country's most famous track is the Milford Track. They call it the finest walk in the world. And it's one of the few that didn't start off as a gold rush mining trail. A pair of It's located in Fiordland National Park, and back in the late 1880s, a pair of guys who were trying to revitalize the economy down here discovered the trail that led over the McKinnon Pass past Sutherland Fall, which is dramatic. And they, from the get-go, turned it into a tourist track. And it opened up in 1888. You begin in Tiano, which is the jumping off spot for a lot of places in Fiordland. And you take a water taxi up to Glad House. You have to stay at the certain huts, and you pretty much have to do it in 4 days. The first day is a very short walk to Clinton Hut. The next day you get to Mentora Hut. The third day is your big day. You climb above the tree line, you cross McKinnon Pass, you drop down. There's Sutherland Falls, where you probably have to spend a couple hours checking that out, and you end up at Dumpling Hut. The fourth and final day, you hike out to Milford Sound. which is really one of the classic settings in New Zealand, and it's a huge tourist attraction. And you end up here, your bus is over here. So there's water taxis that run from here over to there. And or there's a guy there who's renting you a kayak. So you take a couple hours and you paddle across the Milford Sound to where you can pick up your bus. It's magnificent. Milford Sound is really stunning. Nearby is the Rootburn Track, another great walk. It's one of my favorites. And the Rootburn is actually split between Mount Aspiring National Park and Fiordland National Park. And Fiordland is the biggest national park in the country. Actually, it's the biggest national park in the Southern Hemisphere. And for the Rootburn, you begin in Queenstown, which is a high activity, high energy town, big town for downhill skiing in the winter. The Milford, from Queenstown, you begin at Rootburn Shelter, and the first day you would hike along and start climbing right about here to Rootburn Falls Hut, which is right at the tree line. The next day, you keep climbing up past Lake Harris, the Harris Saddle, and cross it over. And then you come along this beautiful alpine ridge walk and then descend to Mackenzie Hut, also right at the tree line. The third and final day, you'd hike out to the Divide Shelter where you'd pick up transportation to Te Anau. It's too difficult to get back to Queenstown. Obviously, it's the second day that you just is stunning. You're above the tree line from the minute you walk outside the hut. You stay above the tree line. It's just really incredible mountainous scenery. Climbing along the way until you pass Harris Lake, and this gentleman isn't that far. Harris Saddle is just around this corner, about right up here. Of course, you can tell it's kind of a rainy day. He's got his rain gear on. The Rakaku track is an easy 3-day walk through the forest, no alpine. It's great huts. Not a lot of people are going down there. That's because it's at Stewart Island. And the challenge here is getting to Stewart Island. You have to go to Invercargill first, and then a lot of people will fly across, but some people will take the ferry across the Fubo Strait. And this is generally the roughest piece of water in New Zealand. So if you have a weak stomach, you might want to pony up a few extra hours and take the small bush plane right over. When you land at Half Moon Bay, though, it's a pretty little town. And the track begins right there and it ends right there 3 days later. So it's an easy track. Stewart Island is very unusual for its lush forest, despite being so far to the south, and its incredible bird life, including kiwis. But the great walk that I've always, it's one of my favorites, is the Kepler. I've done it several times. I did it like 2 years after they opened it. They opened it in 1988, and it's the one that I told my son and his wife, this is the track you ought to walk when they went to New Zealand a few years ago. The Kepler is located again in Fjord National Park, and it was built in 1988 as part of the centennial celebration of New Zealand's first national park. It was also built as a way to relieve the pressure on the Milford, which is right up here, and the Rootburn, which is right over here. This track was built from scratch, and it is the best designed track in the country. It's just the best designed track. For starters, they eliminated the need for special transportation. You begin and end it in Te Anau, or on the edge of Te Anau. You don't need a van taking you out to some remote trailhead. The Kepler begins and ends on the edge of town. You can go to the Fiordland Visitor Center in Te Anau and go up to information desk and say, "Where's the Kepler start?" And they'll turn around. They have a huge window that overlooks Lake Tiano, and they'll point to it. And you'll see the trailheads right there. It's unbelievable. It begins on the edge of Tiano, and the first 4 or 5 kilometers comes around and follows the shoreline, and then it climbs into the mountains for the next 3 days. You can catch a water taxi to cut out those first 4 or 5 kilometers, but I don't think you should. That's what I told my son and his wife. I said, first of all, it's a beautiful walk along the shoreline, and you kind of need to warm up a little bit because when you get to Broad Bay after 4 or 5 kilometers, you're not on a shoreline. It's a steep 2.5 hour climb up. And you climb and you climb, and it's not technical. It's just you're climbing up with that backpack on the whole way. And pretty soon you're thinking, God, we got to be almost at the top. And you come to the sign. You still got 45 minutes to go. That's my daughter-in-law, and she's showing you that she's got the determination to make it to the top. So you climb some more, and just about when you're ready to give up, you break out of the trees into this incredible tussock alpine setting. And it's one of those classic moments in New Zealand tramping when you break out of the trees and you get into the alpine and you turn around and there's Lake Tiano. You can see the entire distance where you began that day and where you are now. It's amazing. And you just now you're rejuvenated. You're pumped. So you hike a little more, another 10, 15 minutes. You go around this bend and there's a Loxmore hut, your hut for the night. Man, it looks like, well, up there after 2.5 hours of climbing, it looks like the Grand Hotel. I'm telling you. The Loxmore was built in like 1889 or 1989, about a year after they opened up the track, and immediately was enlarged. And today it's a 2-level hut. It holds 55 bunks. This right here is the hut warden's where he lives, and it's just it's one of the largest huts you'll ever stay in. Has a drying room, and that's really a nice aspect. If it's been raining all morning, when you get there, you can lay out your wet clothing in this huge room and dry it out. Has a beautiful commons area with tables and chairs and gas rings. You don't even have to take a stove to do the Kepler track. And from the windows, um, you can see right out that beautiful view of Lake Tiano. It's gorgeous. Only thing better than the commons room is the outdoor deck. And if your husband is nice to you, he'll haul up a sack of wine, and you'll have one of the best happy hours you'll ever have. It's incredible view. You go to bed that night though, praying that tomorrow is clear, windless day. And then the next morning, when the hut warden posts the weather report at 8 o'clock a.m., and you realize your prayers have been answered, you waste no time on hitting the trail. From start to almost the finish, this is your alpine day. You'll be above the tree line almost the whole time. And the early morning is best when your legs are fresh and the sun is rising up above the ridges, and it just has that those golden colors on the tussock grass and the alpine vegetation. You begin by sidling the Kepler Mountains. You're climbing up. You can see where the trail goes all the way up to there, but pretty soon, excuse me, you're ridge walking, classic New Zealand ridge walking. You can actually see the trail as it goes up, all the way up here, comes around, and it pretty much stays on top of this ridge. There's climbing to be sure, but it's not hard. It's just steady. The views, however, 360 degrees in a day like this. You can see all around you. You can see other mountains. You can see two or three giant lakes. It's just an amazing day. Some people, um, especially backpackers from a flat land like Michigan, get a little nervous with ridge walking in other areas of the country because the ridges could be very narrow, they could be loose rocks and so forth, and the sides of them can be very steep. But the Kepler is a well-built track. It's wide, it's a great walk, and in places they have built stairways or even put in ridge wires where you might need a little assistance. It's great. And to spend a day like this, just walking across these ridges is magnificent. Mid-afternoon, though, you come to a very special place called Hanging Valley, and there's an emergency shelter there. And again, you're still above the tree line, picnic table, and what we would call an outhouse. In New Zealand, they call those long drops, which I always thought was a pretty appropriate name for such a facility. They also call them loos. And once a tramper came up to me who was going in the opposite direction of the Kepler and said, "Man, there's a loo with a view just up the trail." And he was right. You go to Hanging Valley and you leave that door open, well, you could sit there all day from that long drop because the views are amazing. Not long after Hanging Valley, though, you begin a descent and you're soon back in the forest. And within an hour or so, maybe a little longer, you arrive at Iris Burn Hut for your second night. Iris Burn is obviously not as dramatic as Luxmore, but it's still a really nice hut, and it's next to the stream, Iris Burn Stream, and where there's a waterfall nearby and a really ice cold pool. And if nothing feels better on your feet than that after that long day above the Alpine than to stick your feet in there. The next day, you're following the Iris Burn out the valley through grassy meadows, beech forests. Um, a little anti-dramatic for some people after being up in the Alpine the previous day, but it's an easy day. And when you arrive at the Martamora hut, you realize what a great place it is because 5 minute walk from the hut, there's Manipur Lake with a beach. And you thinking, man, I haven't had a shower in 3 days. It's a great spot. The final day is straightforward out. It's an easy hike. It goes along the Manipur River back towards Teano, and within 3 or 4 hours, you've reached the end of the Kepler track. That always has, for a lot of people, especially from our area, doing an alpine hike like that and finishing it up and being successful just has an incredible sense of accomplishment, especially when it includes an alpine crossing. It's just amazing. You're just really pumped. And with the Kepler, you can reach the end of it, and 30 minutes later, you're sitting at an outdoor pub in Tiano drinking a ice cold pint of that delicious New Zealand beer. Yes, this is the best design track I've ever seen. My favorite tramp, though, in all my years in New Zealand, was the Heafy track. The Heafy, it just it, it it's a great track, but it was really great when I did it with my daughter. Today, the Heafy is a great walk. It was designated so in 2013, and when it became the Great Walk, it became the longest Great Walk. It's 78.4 kilometers, a trek that takes most people 4 to 5 days. And they had to upgrade it. And being a Great Walk, it started drawing larger number of people, so they had to build bigger huts. When Jessica and I did it, however, it was still this relatively secondary trail that featured those great small cozy huts you find along most tracks in New Zealand. The Heafy is located in the Karangi National Park, which is the second largest national park in New Zealand. It's located right around here. The track was cut in the late 1800s when gold was discovered on what was then the remote and almost impossible to reach West Coast. The gold rush faded quite quickly, but the Heaphy endured simply as it was a footpath to the Tasman Sea. In the early 1970s, plans were announced to turn this obscure track into a road to connect Nelson on the Golden Bay with Carmia on the West Coast. That's when the Heath ignited the modern New Zealand conservation movement. Widespread protests quickly led to the government shelving the road project and saving the track. That always amazed me. They said, let's skip building the road, let's leave it as a track. And only in a country like New Zealand would that happen. So a lot of Kiwis hiking the Heaphy at least once is something of a pilgrimage in the honor of their outdoor heritage. And it's amazing how many Kiwis will do it, not because of the scenery, which is wonderful, but because what it meant for the conservation movement in that country. My daughter was in college when she flew out down to New Zealand to join me. I had 3 months in New Zealand that time. She had 3 weeks, her Christmas break at MSU. So she flew from Detroit to LAX, jumped on the plane that night for Auckland, where I met her. The next morning, I met her actually, it was the next morning. Then we jumped on another plane for Nelson in the South Island. A day and a half after she arrived in New Zealand, she was standing at the start of the Heaphy track. Jet lag is always a problem for overseas travelers. This is this is her running out of gas when we reached a shelter for lunch. It's just tough. I find jet lag to be worse when you're coming home, flying from west to east, but it's something you have to take into account any trip you take to New Zealand. But being young and excited about our venture, she rebounded quickly that afternoon when the track leveled out. That's because most people will hike the Heaphy going from west to east. And if you do that, or excuse me, from east to west, and when you do that, all the climbing's done in the first half day. When we reached our first hut, the Perry Saddle Hut, after that first long day on the track, she thought it was the Hilton. The benches and the bunks were so inviting. A lot of people ask me what I usually eat, my supplies when I go tramping in New Zealand. Really not much different than what we do. They do have a company down there with backcountry cuisine, and they do a wonderful job with freeze dried food. The spices and the selection they offer are really amazing. We used a number of them on that Heaphy thing. The other nice thing I like about New Zealand is that it's really fairly close to Southeast Asia. So their selection of ramen noodles is unbelievable. This one might be chicken, but they have curry and hot pepper and everything else. And of course, you can go to any supermarket and get the same things that we have up here, noodles and cheese and quick cooking rice dishes and so forth. After that next morning, boy, we stepped out of the hut on our second day and it was sunny and warm and we were well rested. This is the reason I love those iconic New Zealand huts. With the Heaphy, as I was mentioning, most people go from east to west. So you begin at Brown Hut, excuse me, with that brutal climb. And then we stayed at the Perry Saddle the first night and then moved to Saxon Hut the second night. The third night, we went to McKay Hut. The fourth, the Heaphy Hut, and then out. We're now officially on the West Coast. That first day, hiking to the Perry Saddle. Excuse me. We're actually going to what they call a subalpine crossing. And it was fairly easy hiking in the beginning because the Heaphy track still follows a portion of the original Gold Rush mining trail. Looks like a two track almost. But eventually it was a true track, and it was well planked when we wanted it. There were bridges when we needed one, and it wasn't long before Jessica encountered her first swing bridge in New Zealand. Great entertainment, and they swing, yeah, a lot. 2 days before Christmas, though, we reached the McKay Hut, and this is the original one. It was small, it was cozy. There were like 4 or 5 other people there. Um, they've have since rebuilt this one, and it's right on the edge of the mountains. We had dinner, and then that night we had this spectacular view and sunset. It was amazing because I remember her and I sitting outside, and I said, "Honey, that's where we're hiking tomorrow." I said, "We're descending these mountains. We're getting to the Heaphy River, and the next hut is right where the Heaphy River empties into Tasman Bay. One of the great locations for a hut in New Zealand." We could see from the McKay Hut our entire walk the next day. And I said, "We're doing it on Christmas Eve." We descended the mountains that next morning. We crossed the Heaphy River on the longest swing bridge I've ever been on, got to the other side, and everything changed. We were now following the Heaphy River. The hiking was relatively flat. And the great part about it is we kept dipping into forests of Naku palm trees. It was really wild. And after we got a pretty early start. And I think about 1 o'clock, we reached where we wanted to go. And that's where the Heaphy River dumps into the Tasman Sea. This is the hut they have now. This is the one they had to build when it became a Great Walk. It's fairly large and it's a typical Great Walk hut. This is where we stayed, though. This little shack. I think it slept like 8 people. Christmas Eve. I remember there was 3 New Zealanders there. There was two Americans, and there was this Canadian young man who I was pretty sure was trying to hit on my daughter, but I didn't say anything. And we were there early in the afternoon, and we grabbed our bunks, dumped our gear, and then went to the Tasman Sea, which is just spectacular. You can't swim here because the undertows are far too dangerous. If you want to swim, you swim in the Heaphy River, but you can walk that beautiful wide beach for miles if you want. It's really interesting. The beach combing was unbelievable. We starfish and crabs and all kinds of shellfish. I got really lucky when we were beach combing because I found a cluster of the famous New Zealand green lip mussels. Yeah. Pulled out my Swiss Army knife, wandered into the Tasman Sea just a little bit, just enough to get to that boulder, and I took them off and we took them back to the hut. And that was my Christmas Eve dinner. Never had a better Christmas Eve dinner. I steamed them on my little MSR stove. I even had some fresh garlic with me at the time. And their green lip mussels are the juiciest and the largest mussels you'll ever have. My daughter wasn't into mussels at that point, so I think she had ramen noodles or something. That night, we caught another dynamite sunset. And I said, Jessica, tomorrow's day 5. It's our last day. We're going to hike right along the Tasman Sea to the end of the track. And I said, that night, we have accommodations at a really nice place called the Last Resort. It's in Carmia. And I said, they got a Christmas Day buffet. It was going to be Christmas. I said, if we can get there by 1 o'clock, we can enjoy this Christmas Day buffet. but we're gonna have to get a fairly early start. Most people do this hike in 5 hours, I said, you know. And so I said we really have to get going by 7 in the morning. So we went to bed, and like 6:15 the next morning, someone was shaking my sleeping bag. My daughter said, "Dad, it's time to get up. We got to get going. I am not missing that Christmas Day buffet." And we did. I'd love to show you pictures of Jessica going on this trail, but I don't think I saw her much after the first mile or so. The scenery, though, here is magnificent. It's one of the finest walks um, of any track in New Zealand that's non-alpine. You, you do climb into the forest and the palm tree forests, but a lot of it's right along the shoreline, right where the Tasman Sea is. It's just magnificent and incredibly scenic as well. And I was stopping a lot and I was shooting photos and stuff like that. And all of a sudden, wow, I popped out of the trees. And there was the end of the track and my daughter patiently waiting for me. And as you can see, it was a 5 hour walk, but we did it in 2.5. Unbelievable. It wasn't even 10 o'clock when we got there. And there's a phone there. We rang up the last resort. They sent their van out. They picked us up. And they took us back, and we had a beautiful room there. Um, two double beds, soft beds with sheets and blankets, uh, a bathroom with flush toilets and hot showers. And there in the middle of one of the beds was a big package from the US. My wife was clever enough to get that package to the last resort so we'd have something to open on Christmas Day, little gifts and stuff like that. But the best part of it was that we were the first two people at 1 o'clock to be in line for that Christmas Day buffet, and it was great. It was held outside. It was being the middle of New Zealand summer. It was fresh fruits, salads, a lot of lamb dishes. They had a grill going. They were grilling bangers, what they call sausages, and incredible dessert table. But what my daughter really fell in love with, as all people should, was the sausage rolls. Nothing says New Zealand cuisine like a sausage roll. You grab this beautiful sausage roll and with its buttery, flaky crust and that spicy sausage in the middle, and you take a nice big bite, and there's grease dripping down your chin onto your shirt, and it's the most unhealthy thing you can probably eat there. But after 5 days in the Hefe, nothing tastes better than a sausage roll. I don't want to mislead anybody that when you go to New Zealand, you got to do great walks. In fact, a lot of people they steer clear of them. You have to reserve spots in the bunks. There's going to be more people involved, and there's other tracks that are a lot less known with just as good scenery. There's even private tracks there too. These are tracks that often cross large sheep ranches and so forth, and you would actually stay at really nice accommodations, nice huts, or even at the farmer's house. And the beauty of them is they're able to take your backpack. You don't carry it; they take it, to the next place where you're staying at, and all you take is a day pack where you have your rain gear, your camera, and your lunch. There's also private companies that maintain private huts on some of the Great Walk tracks, like the Milford, um, the Rupern, and other tracks. So there's a wide range of possibilities in New Zealand. You don't have to do Great Walks. In fact, you don't even have to stay in a hut. You could go to New Zealand and just do day hikes, and you could making use of all that transportation they provide to trailheads, and you'd see some incredible scenery, and you would reach the Alpine. But at night, you'd return to the fine accommodations and restaurants in places like Queenstown, Tiano, Nelson, and so forth, and Christchurch. It's just great. But if you're interested and truly experience New Zealand, tramping in New Zealand, the first step in any adventure is you have to go. You have to want to experience this incredible country with its friendly people and all those 60 million sheep they have down there, and get on a plane and fly 10 hours over to Auckland. I promise you that if you do, you'll never regret it. And if you're like me, you'll end up going down under again and again and again. Thank you very much.